Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes to join online before we get started. Okay, I think that we can get started and let some folks trickle in. So everybody, thank you so much for joining our discussion today. We've got some truly excellent speakers online, and so I'm really excited for us to jump in. By the way, I'm Rebecca Ye. I'm a senior research analyst with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I'm first going to cover some formatting logistics, then introduce our topic at hand, and then ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll jump right in. We'll be using a discussion format, so I'll kick us off with a couple of prepared questions that our panelists may wish to weigh in on, and then we'll switch over to questions from the audience. So if you have a question you want the panel to answer, you can submit a question using the questions module below. So you should see something at the bottom of your screen, hopefully, that says Q&A. You can use that function to submit some questions. We'll try to get through them, but there are a lot of folks on this webinar today, so we'll make sure to follow up if we can. And then I also just wanted to mention we have the chat box enabled as well, and everybody on this webinar is a really great resource. All of the other participants are in a similar boat, so we encourage you to engage with each other through the chat box that you should be able to see once you click the chat function also at the bottom of your screen. Yeah, so please share your challenges, questions, lessons learned, and learn from each other, and we'll be closely monitoring the Q&A for questions for the panelists. So as we all know here, rental assistance has always been a critical stopgap measure for households facing tough times, and it is more critical than ever in this public health crisis where staying home is tantamount to staying healthy and maintaining public health. This work is so important and evolving so quickly. New challenges and new lessons learned every single day. And so today I'd like us to focus on early learnings in designing, administering, and implementing rental assistance programs, facing challenges including but not limited to constrained budgets, extremely high need, and unusual circumstances that prevent the ways programs typically reach out to and engage with tenants. On that note, NLIHC has been systematically tracking rental assistance programs that have emerged or scaled up in the past 5 months since COVID-19 has emerged as a crisis. As of late last week, we were tracking 320 of these programs. Around approximately 25% of these programs have closed and exhausted their sources of funding. Nearly 60% use first come, first served or lottery systems as mechanisms to choose who should receive funding rather than being able to fund all those who are really in need. And then on top of that, 84% of programs offer aid for 3 months or less. And we've all seen that this is lasting much longer than that. At the end of the day, the funding for rental assistance programs is wholly inadequate, and Congress has consistently failed to act for months now to fix this looming crisis. Despite the growing threat of eviction and homelessness, Congress has instead adjourned for August recess, leaving millions of renters and people experiencing homelessness without the resources and protections they need to remain stably housed. The stakes couldn't be higher, and it is extremely urgent that negotiations must be restarted and a comprehensive deal that includes robust housing and homelessness protections and resources must be reached as soon as possible. So if you have a couple of minutes to share, please, please, please contact your members of Congress and demand that they get back to work to pass rent relief now. There will be a link in the chat box to tell you a little bit more on how you can act and hold Congress accountable. These quick facts on how many programs have closed, how long programs are giving aid for, it's really just skimming the surface of what rental assistance programs are looking like in this moment of time. And so we're attempting to learn more. In a partnership with the University of Pennsylvania's Housing Initiative at Penn and the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy at New York University, we've launched an in-depth survey on rental assistance program design and implementation. So if you are administering a program or you know somebody administering a program and you'd like to share your knowledge or volunteer your colleagues' knowledge, please email me at ryae@nlhc.org. Okay, so let's get started with some brief introductions. Can everybody introduce themselves and provide a little bit of information about your organization or program? Claudia, could you start?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Let me share my screen. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
All right. So hi, everyone.
Actually, sorry, could you?
Did I share the wrong thing?
Yeah, you're sharing a Word document as well as a, there we go. Yeah.
All right, thanks guys. Hi everyone, my name is Claudia Aiken. I'm the director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. We are a small but mighty team of housing researchers at the University of Pennsylvania. And this summer, we've been working intensively with practitioners across the country as they develop their rental assistance programs in response to COVID-19. So we're working particularly with the cities of Atlanta, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Oakland, the city and county of Los Angeles, and the California Community Foundation. And for each of our partners, we provide technical assistance in the form of data analytics, best practice research, and knowledge sharing across cities so that they can learn from each other's experiences with rental assistance. And for most of our partners, we're also doing a formal evaluation of their rental assistance program by conducting a longitudinal survey of program applicants, both those who did and did not receive assistance, in order to understand the true impact of the assistance on their housing and economic outcomes long-term. We're also surveying landlords to understand their decisions to engage or not to engage in these programs. And finally, by comparing program implementation and take-up across sites, we better understand which features work and which don't. So definitely check out our website, housinginitiative.org, for lots more resources, downloadable data sets, and info on all of the cities we're working with. At HIP, we know the critical nature of the work housing practitioners are doing right now. And when we engage with our partner cities, it's a deep civic partnership that comes at no cost to them. All of our work is funded through our own research funds and foundation grants. So if anyone on the call today has any questions for us or is interested in partnering with us, please do reach out. And lastly, I just want to thank Rebecca and Andrew so much for organizing this panel, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Claudia. Whitney, could you introduce yourself next?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Again, as Rebecca mentioned, my name is Whitney Demetrius from CHAPA, which is Citizens Housing and Planning Association. And our mission is to encourage production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals. And really, we believe, like I imagine many of you on the call, that every person in here in Massachusetts should have a safe, healthy, and affordable place to call home, right? And so we achieve this by expanding access to housing, sort of developing the field, and advocating for opportunities, particularly in our Municipal Engagement Initiative program, which I am a part of. And sort of that program sprang from the idea that many communities don't have a strong pro-housing advocacy group. And so what we do is work to build that out in as many communities as we possibly can throughout the state. Because we know that oftentimes local initiatives in housing really happens on the local level. Sort of it makes or breaks the initiatives varying on support levels. And so many communities throughout the state of Massachusetts lean on us and call upon us for various resources. And particularly in this moment of COVID, folks are contacting us and we're wanting to start emergency rental assistance programs. And so they were also contacting some of our partner organizations, Massachusetts Housing Partnership and the Department of Housing and Community Development. And so we put our heads together to sort of put together a webinar, which we had many participants join, to give some best practices about how to get started and where funding streams they could tap into, et cetera. And so from there, after putting together the webinar, which again is available on our website if folks want to take a look at that, but we also put together a survey that DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, sort of put together to reach far out to our 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts to ask them about whether or not they are either implementing or designing a program or considering doing so. So in gathering all that information, we then put together a report that included some of those best practices, guidelines, et cetera, that we talked about in our webinar, but as well had a database of each of those communities who had enacted or were considering enacting a program locally. And so the idea of that was really intended to assist state, regional, and local governments and nonprofit agencies to sort of better coordinate with each other around their local programs and to continue some best practices and peer-to-peer learning. So we published those guidelines, as I mentioned, and all of that is available on our website and as well in the Massachusetts Housing Partnership Housing Toolbox, which is an excellent guideline to many of those best practices and tools. So we look to hopefully in the future do a follow-up webinar to kind of see what those communities were able to do, what lessons they learned, what best practices they developed, but also to be able to do a survey and build out that database even further as well. And so I hope to share some of what we learned in doing all of that with you all today. So thank you again, Rebecca and May and Andrew for having me on today.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Greg, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Also, thanks for having me. Really glad to be part of this great panel. I work at Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit that's been the city's intermediary for doing a range of housing programs since the 1960s. These days, we provide the gap financing for low-income housing tax credit projects. We run a range of home repair grant and loan programs. We dispose land for affordable housing. And in the current pandemic, we were designated as the entity to manage the city's rental assistance programs. We launched our own local program on May 12th. That was funded with CARES money that went to the city with our CDBG money. And then the state launched its own program that was made available in every county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we were the designated entity to run that program in Pennsylvania. So we've been doing that for the last couple months as well. And then we have a third program that we launched pre-COVID, which provides locally financed rent subsidy for tenants in affordable housing projects that we call our shallow rent program. And then finally, I'll just say we also have 2 loan programs that we made available post-pandemic for landlords. So we have both of them are for small landlords who have 15 or fewer units in their portfolios. One of them provides working capital, short-term working capital loans, and the other provides longer-term capital improvement loans for making property repairs. So we feel very strongly that in a city like Philadelphia, we know that a large portion of our affordable housing is naturally occurring affordable housing that's owned by small landlords. And we know that small landlords are small business owners. So we're simultaneously trying to provide assistance for tenants and also financial resources for landlords so that they can keep their businesses afloat and keep those affordable housing units online. Look forward to speaking about all that more later in the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. And Dominique, last but not least.
Yes, thank you very much, Rebecca, for inviting me to be a panelist today. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dominique Williams, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Housing Stability in the City of Boston. Our office has a mission of helping Boston residents to find and maintain safe, stable, and affordable housing opportunities. We've been in operation since 2016, and we offer housing crisis assistance for tenants who are facing eviction. We help to develop resources and workshops that inform tenants of their rights. And we also help to create housing policies that will stabilize Boston's renters. So the work that we've done and have been doing for the past few years really has put us in a unique position to quickly mobilize and to bring our resources online and to quickly stand up a rental relief lottery in the early weeks of April, which made us in Boston one of the first cities to do so. So I think the first iteration of funding was $3 million, which was made in April. In June, Mayor Walsh committed an additional $5 million in funding. And I'm looking forward to just answering some more questions and hearing from my fellow panelists about their thoughts as well.
I am too. Well, thank you everybody for introducing yourself. I think that I'll start out pretty broadly. How have programs faced challenges in getting rental assistance programs off the ground or expanded to meet the significant and sudden coronavirus-related need for rental assistance? Dominique, do you want to start?
So I think there's been a couple of things that we found to be challenges as we were getting the program off the ground quickly. First, we recognized that in terms of technology, we knew that that was ultimately it became a barrier for a lot of applicants who just didn't have access to either computers or internet service. So in order to try to alleviate that problem, we put in place volunteers to call people back, to reach out to them and help them to fill out the applications online. Next, we recognized that there were a lot of applicants who spoke English as a second language and may have needed to receive some interpretation services, so we needed to make interpretation services available. Luckily, we already had access to a language line, which we use in the city of Boston pretty frequently, but we did find out that 24% of our calls were coming from Spanish speakers. So we had to address that. And then we also are still seeing, we run a call line on a regular basis when we're still seeing average of 4 times the amount of calls that are coming into our office. So it was important for us to try to mobilize volunteers from across the city to do some outreach, but also to handle the influx of calls. I guess I will also add that because we are in Massachusetts and we're really lucky to have a really solid eviction moratorium in place, which is one of the strongest in the country. So that ultimately helps to protect tenants while we were ironing through some of the challenges.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with, well, the technology and the language barriers is something that really resonates probably with a lot of programs. Greg, I remember you mentioning something along those lines. Do you want to talk next?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely some of the same issues. We also have an eviction moratorium through the end of August, which we're now getting very close to, and we're waiting to see whether City Council decides to extend that or not. And we also had a lot of renters who didn't have internet access or spoke other languages. We worked with our network of housing counselors who we currently have under contract to do outreach. And so they were able to do direct phone calls and have people deliver hard copy documents and get them to us. So we were really lucky to be able to utilize that network of, I think we have about 30 housing counselors under contract. The other thing that we had going for us was that prior to the pandemic, we were actually in the process of designing a rental assistance program. It was included in the mayor's budget that he announced back in, I don't know, whenever that was, earlier in the year, pre-COVID. So we were supposed to be getting about $35 million to set up a locally financed rental assistance program. And what was interesting was the plan was for us to do a randomized control trial with 1,000 people whose landlords received the assistance and then 1,000 people where we did direct cash to the tenants. So that was supposed to be a 5-year program. And Vincent Reyna, who Claudia works with, was supposed to be one of the evaluators on it. And then COVID came and the city found itself in a $700 million budget deficit, and our program and everybody else's got cut. So then, we used, like I said before, our CDBG COVID CV money to stand up a rental assistance program. Obviously, CDBG money can't be used to go direct to tenants, so we had to just do a landlord delivery model. But we were already in process of setting up infrastructure. So the biggest thing for us was setting up the technology backend. We have a great group of programmers on our staff, and they set up a really robust system using software called QuickBase. So we have a web-based front end that feeds into a QuickBase back end. So we've used that for both phase 1 and phase 2 and sort of evolved it along. And we have a really great back end system now for hopefully continue to do rent assistance even after the CARES funds are exhausted.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious. So Greg and Dominique, you both mentioned that you're using technology on online applications in addition to reaching out in other ways. What kinds of strategies have you been able to use to streamline these online processes for renter applicants?
Well, I can jump back in. So yeah, I mean, we've tried to make the web-based front end as easy to navigate as possible and guide people through what they need to submit. So if you don't upload an income document, it won't let you continue, for example. But we're still getting a lot of people who upload wrong information or documents that are illegible, things like that. So we have had to reach back out to thousands of tenants, and we send out a weekly email that's customized to thousands of tenants and landlords, saying you need to submit this, you need to submit that, and then giving them a customized link where they can go and it just has the document upload area. But I mean, the biggest challenge, frankly, is just people not responding, not submitting full application information, or landlords not responding. I mean, the landlords responding is one of the biggest ones. And it's one of the reasons why I was so interested in doing the direct cash to tenants, because of course, if the landlord's not part of the process, then you don't have to worry about that second step at all. But in our phase one, we've had 46% of landlords participate. And in phase two, we've had 39%. So huge drop off due to landlords not responding. And we're about to do a survey to try and figure out some of the reasons behind that. I mean, we can guess, but we'd like to hear from the landlords directly.
Yeah, I think over the 2 lotteries that we've initiated, we've had to streamline the process a few times. And we noticed that tenants were having difficulty obtaining financial documentation in the first round. So in the second round, we provided an affidavit in lieu of those income files. We also removed the income requirement, recertification requirement for tenants who are coming back and saying that they need an additional month of rent. So once you income certify the first time, it's not necessary for you to continue to do so to access additional funding later. And generally, we're just trying to make the process a little easier. We're probably going to have a 3rd round of funding, and we're looking at removing the pre-screening application altogether, the pre-screen form altogether, and just having one single application. So that way we don't have to try to do the follow-up to get a full completed application from people at a later time. Because we have also had some challenges in terms of the number of people who've actually responded and completed applications.
I'm also curious to hear your perspectives, Claudia and Whitney. I know it's a little bit more unique in that you have a broader swath of programs that you've seen. What do you think, what have you seen as some of the biggest challenges?
I think one of the major things we've seen is that most cities and counties and other localities have not done anything like this before. So just building up the capacity to implement a program like this for many of them is a real challenge. And we've seen people address that in different ways. While some may have the capacity to do all this in-house, they often will have to pull from other city agencies, other departments, even networks of housing counselors, as Greg mentioned, to help with the rollout and then processing the applications. Sometimes even that is too much of a heavy lift if you don't have the housing department infrastructure in place. And in those cases, we've seen cities and counties reach out and contract with a third-party administrator or rely on an existing network of nonprofit service providers to do intake and also process applications. And what you have in those cases are, different advantages and different challenges that come with each capacity model. I would say with the more decentralized models, outreach might be much easier since people already know and trust some of those local service providers. But at the same time, you can't do bulk processing. It may be difficult to get money out the door. You might have equity issues if some organizations are higher capacity than others. So we've seen cities and counties be super innovative in how they address this. And it's really interesting to see the different models that are evolving.
Yeah, I would add to that in terms of what we're seeing. We definitely see that as a best practice working with an administrative agency. For one, they already have buy-in from the community. They are familiar with administrating, and like Claudia mentioned, they have the infrastructure and sort of moving it forward more efficiently and more quickly. So that's certainly a best practice that we found. But again, sort of on a broader spectrum, we're seeing many of the things that Gregory and Dominique mentioned as well, but also there's challenges in terms of language barriers, both for the renters as well as the landlords. right? There are situations where landlords are in informal arrangements with tenants, and so they're reluctant to get into agreement with these agencies for various reasons, and so they're reluctant to give paperwork and to go through the process. So that certainly has been a barrier in sort of moving these things forward more efficiently, right? And again, where communities have tried to make applications available online as well as paper applications, as Gregory mentioned, there have been many instances where things are just not readable, right? They're illegible, and there's sometimes a hard loop around where they're now following up with folks who initially applied and then maybe found other resources and other help and solutions. And so they're sort of working on trying to close that loop in terms of figuring out, how to assist people more immediately. But again, it's sort of to be expected in emergency sort of situations. But again, each community is different in terms of what we're also set up to do in order to get it forward. So here in Massachusetts, we have the Community Preservation Act program, which is sort of a smart growth tool that allows for communities to put money aside for open space, historic preservation, and affordable housing, right? So communities who've already adopted that program were sort of able to, they had monies aside in trusts, et cetera, to kind of catapult that forward, where other communities were sort of a step behind in that process. And so again, many of them are now rethinking and trying to work on those sort of things. But those are some of the barriers that really did come up for folks to kind of get it going, as well as like trying to get buy-in to the community, or delayed processes in terms of decision making, like delayed town meetings, et cetera. So to move those things forward. So many communities who are considering and now hopefully have implemented, but are still sort of in the process of contracting with those administrative agencies, and how does that work, and et cetera. So those are some things we've seen overall.
Absolutely. And just to kind of follow back on a thread that I was hearing earlier, I think that as this is a tough time because people are strapped in terms of capacity, human-wise as well, just the kinds of capacity and infrastructure that is already existing and that needs to be scaled up. How have your programs that you've been dealing with, how have you been addressing, a shortage of staffing or capacity? I'm also kind of seeing this question being echoed in some of the audience members' questions. How can you handle such a high volume of requests for assistance when you only have so much staffing?
Yeah, I can take this one. I mean, I know our office is a small team as well, 7 people. And we've received over 5,000 calls just from the second round of lottery alone, and have opened over 1,500 cases, for people who are calling and saying that they need different kinds of housing assistance. So we couldn't handle all of that with just 7 people. We needed to reach out to other city offices and to enlist their support to help us to answer the calls, to help us to call back applicants, and to do some of the case management on these applications. So it's definitely been a group activity. It's been something that we've all kind of had to put our hands on in order to make this successful.
Yeah, definitely. So when we did our first round, we only had the application open for 5 days, and we got 12,000 applications. And in our second round, this one's rolling, but we're over 10,000 already. So what we did initially was, like I said before, we worked with our housing counselors to do some direct outreach. We also worked with a legal aid nonprofit who already has a hotline to field phone calls. So they've been extremely helpful. We recruited staff. We're under the umbrella of planning and development. So we recruited staff from the rest of our department. So we had about 20 people from the planning department help us out, fielding help desk calls and doing income reviews. And then that gave us enough time to reprogram 9 people from other parts within our own agency and get them trained on this program. So we now have 14 full-time people just working on rent assistance, and we're hiring an additional 8 right now. Some of my staff are in interviews right now, so hopefully we can get them onboarded soon. So, and then the last thing that we did was we worked with the mayor's office to put out a call to every department in the entire city, asking for volunteers and telling them specifically that they'd be working on rent assistance. And we have 23 volunteers who we got through that, who we trained over the course of a week. And that's been actually really successful because these are volunteers who knew what they were getting into, knew what the assignment was going to be, didn't have a lot of work to do, and wanted to do something where they were giving back to the city. So these volunteers have been extremely motivated and effective. And just really enthusiastic about the program.
That's really great. I'm starting to realize that we're beginning to, we've gone through half of our time here. So I just want to kind of flag that we should, if people can be more brief on these next responses. We've got one more question that I think would be really valuable for us to answer before we turn to some of the audience questions. So given all of this that's going on, the digital divide, language barriers, and other issues, what are some best practices that you've had in reaching tenants who are most in need and getting them successfully enrolled?
I think this is a good opportunity for me to just highlight some of the really good work that we've been doing with our vendor partners. In addition to increasing capacity in the city of Boston, with City of Boston employees, we also have programs that we usually do work with on a regular basis, including, I see Chris Norris in the comments saying that they're actually one of our providers for city flex funds, as well as for our rental relief fund. So some of our vendor partners have also been extremely helpful in that regard.
I think one thing that I've seen that I think is really innovative is that if a program is a lottery and therefore has an application window during which time applicants can enroll, it can be really useful to analyze those applications as they come in to understand where in the city or county they're coming from, who those applicants are in comparison to the broader eligible pool, and then to target outreach based on that. And that's something that Philadelphia did and that we've also helped other cities do.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So as our 5-day application window was open, throughout the day, we were tracking data on which zip codes were getting more applications, percentage of people who said that they were Hispanic or non-Hispanic. And we use that to do proactive outreach through our housing counselors and also through our media approach. So on the first day, for example, we saw a lower percentage of applicants who were Hispanic than we were expecting within the general population. So we did a lot of outreach to the Spanish-speaking news outlets, did several interviews the next day, and then the third day, we saw a huge uptake in that to get us to the levels we were expecting. So we tried to use the data that we were collecting real time to respond and do proactive marketing and outreach.
If I could just rattle off a few examples that we've seen, in addition to what fellow panelists have mentioned. I think Gregory mentioned it earlier, just keeping it simple, right? That certainly helps in trying to get those applications out and completed, which is often an issue as far as having complete applications. So the idea is just to kind of have a confluence of approaches, the hard and soft applications, allowing photos to be taken on your phone of those various documents to support the applications, things we've seen. We've also seen drive-by applications, right, where folks can stay in their vehicle, they drive through and they drop off their applications, as well as they're able to have some consultations to get some overview of information as far as the application. So that was some innovative things we've seen in response specifically to COVID, as well as pairing it with other resources. So pairing it with legal aid assistance funds in terms of the application, working with partnering agencies. Where do you make your applications accessible? Post offices, through interfaith groups, partnering with them. United Way actually has done some things through the school lunches, free school lunches and free programs. So sort of meeting people where they are in terms of getting that, that information out.
Thank you so much, everybody, for chiming in on that. I think that these are all really, really, really great and interesting examples. Okay, so we're going to transition over to some audience questions, and just a reminder that we'll be addressing questions in the Q&A box, and also panelists, if you want to take a look at that box as well, you can also type out some questions. I think that there are maybe a couple of specific questions, but yeah. And also, I'm also really happy to see such an active chat box right now, so please continue to share and engage with each other in the chat box. I'm already seeing some really great knowledge sharing going on. So this is a question that's been coming up from the audience, as well as, everybody's asking it, I guess. Are programs asking concessions of landlords? And if so, how have you navigated those trade-offs between making sure that tenants get the assistance, as well as having that dollar stretch a little bit farther?
Well, yeah, in our program, we required landlords to have a rental license with the city and to be current in taxes to the city, and not have any open code violations.
Mm-hmm.
I think some pretty typical, oh, sorry, Dominique, did I cut you off?
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
Did you want to go ahead? Or?
Yeah, sure, I'll just go really quickly. So I think some typical asks are that landlords don't raise rent, that they don't evict people who are receiving assistance, that they be registered with the city. But if you require that, it's often necessary to make sure that they can register quickly in the rental registry, whatever form that takes. Some places have asked landlords to forgive some percentage of back rent or to discount current rent. So if you ask too much, obviously, some landlords will choose not to participate. For some, it's just not worth it to register with the city because of the cost of perhaps bringing their property to code. And you might really miss some vulnerable tenants in that way. So each of these things is a trade-off, and it really depends on the amount of the assistance and how much your landlords trust the providing agency.
Yeah, and I think for City of Boston, that was a question that we really grappled with when we were standing up the second round of funding. What can we ask for that is going to still allow tenants to access the money and not turn landlords off from engaging in the program? So we do have a requirement for mediation, landlord mediation, in the event that there is some sort of rental problem or some sort of problem paying the rent going down the line as the crisis unfolds. For the third round of funding, we're also hoping to have a sample rental arrearage agreement in place that just provides some more fair and balanced terms for both the landlords and the tenants if there's an issue paying the rent, since we know that this crisis is going to continue for another couple months at least.
I'd love to highlight an example, sorry, Gregory, that we've seen in one of our communities in Massachusetts, Stowe, actually, who has a landlord that owns the bulk of the rental properties in that community. And so the agency was able to come up with, use it as an opportunity area to really negotiate terms. And so they sort of came up with something in terms of reducing the rent by 15%, and then allowing the tenant to pay 15%, and that the program would pay the remaining amount. So that was something that was really innovative, and I think very unique in that they were able to negotiate with that landlord who owned the bulk of the rental properties in that community. So those are some, I just wanted to be able to highlight that particular example. And again, we're in our database, we have those sort of details of communities that have these unique instances. And so what's great is that folks can access that database, then and find the contact information right on that Excel spreadsheet and contact them directly to see how did they do that as well.
Just as a quick follow-up, Whitney, how did you all decide on 15%?
Yeah, so that actually was from the community in Stowe, Massachusetts. And so again, in terms of how they got to that, I believe it had to do with a series of sort of negotiation, right? And what we sort of share with folks more broadly is to make sure that you're entering into these sort of things in terms of foregoing evictions and rent reductions, et cetera, to make things reasonable so that the landlord wants to participate with you in negotiations. And so in the particulars of how that happened, what's great about the database is that folks can contact them directly and kind of see and ask those sort of intimate play-by-play details. And so, yeah, but the idea is to do things that are reasonable. And I think this was a sort of a unique case.
Mm-hmm.
I think just jumping in quickly on that, even when you don't have a situation in which one landlord owns, most rental properties, it is useful in some cases to sit down with landlords associations and, kind of use them as a sounding board to see what might be reasonable, what people might be able to get on board with. And we've seen that happen. Yep.
Yeah, to Claudia's point, we've been meeting on a regular basis with the largest small landlord organization in Philly. And when we were designing the landlord loan programs, we met with them several times first, and they helped us design the programs in a way that they thought would be effective. And also to Dominique's point, we have a new program that I'm involved with that we're trying to get off the ground to do eviction diversion, where you've pre-filing before landlords are allowed to file for eviction. They have to apply to the diversion program and go through a mediation session. So we're currently working with members of City Council who authored that legislation and trying to figure out the best way to deliver that program and get that stood up in the next few weeks if possible.
Gotcha. Interesting. It seems like everybody is trying to use a lot of different strategies to get at the issue. I'm going to have us switch gears and talk about funding really quick. We had a participant ask about how are you using federal funding outside of the CARES Act to stretch rental assistance out? Have you been using any home funds or regular CDBG, et cetera, et cetera?
For the City of Boston, the first $3 million actually came from City of Boston operating funds. And then the second round of funding, we did use federal dollars. The third round, we're planning to use CDBG.
Yeah, the biggest issue for us in the past has been the public service cap on CDBG, which so we couldn't use more than 15%, and rent assistance counts as public service. So the fact that that was waived for the CV funds and the current year CDBG funds was really huge. So we're using both, and we're also using home funds to supplement. And, we hope that, folks in DC will look at the effects of lifting the 15% public service cap, is something that maybe could possibly be permanent, because I think that would let us use those dollars a lot more flexibly.
For sure. And then actually this is kind of calling back to another question I've been seeing from the audience is, can you speak a little bit more about concerns your organization has faced around duplication of benefits? How are you making sure that that's not happening while also getting funding out the door quickly? Because those two kind of seem to be at odds a little bit for anybody.
In Boston, we're very fortunate to have one of the administrators of our rental relief lottery is also administering state rental relief. So they're able to cross-reference and see who's actually applied to which. And so I think that's probably not a unique situation that we're in Boston, but that's really one of the few ways to prevent people from kind of double dipping.
Yeah, we're basically in the same boat. I mean, since my agency administers both our local program and the state program for our city, we're able to cross-reference those lists. So somebody who got assistance in the first round can get assistance from the second round, but it can't be for the same months. So in the first round, we specifically allocated it for May, June, July, or June, July, August, and we have that in our system. So then if they applied for round two, we'll just make sure that it's staggered and it's different months.
If I would add anything in terms of what we're seeing overall, there's been some programs who had the requirement that you had to apply for one stream of funding, and if you get denied, then you can qualify for their particular local assistance funds. And so they did that in order to sort of meet the gaps for folks, right? And kind of isolate that for people who really needed the assistance and weren't able to qualify on other ends. However, they did see it as sort of a barrier at some point for folks actually applying. They saw sort of a lack of responses and applications because of the delay of time and other factors. And so they later reconsidered and sort of rescinded that particular requirement, sort of leaning more or less upon the fact that they wanted to be able to help people in immediate situations, emergency situations. And so, our organizations really don't get sort of in the weeds of that because we're not administering a program ourselves, but we understand that some people sort of weigh these factors differently in terms of, do you supply the immediate assistance, or do you outweigh that in terms of knowing that it could either be applied to the current or future need, since the funding is going directly to the landlord, right? In many situations. And so our organization doesn't sort of get in that, but we've been hearing a lot of feedback in terms of some lessons learned where organizations have sort of shifted some of those requirements. Claudia, I see you nodding.
Yes, this is a slightly different issue, but one that Dominique alluded to earlier, and that is, do you ask for proof of COVID-related income losses, or do you ask people to self-certify? And we've definitely seen issues, that kind of proof can be very hard to get in the midst of a pandemic. For example, if an applicant was never given a notice that they were laid off, it can be difficult. You'd have to work with that person to maybe try to get their former employer to certify. Another example is when applicants left work to take care of children due to the closure of daycare centers. That daycare center might not necessarily have provided any kind of formal proof that that was the case. So in some instances, we've seen provider agencies just go with self-certification as a way to get better uptake.
Yeah, we did self-certify in phase 1, but the state won't let us do that in phase 2. So we have to show the 30% income loss or that they applied for Pennsylvania unemployment assistance after March 1st. But we still required income documents in phase 1 because we were using CDBG and we had to make sure that households were under the definitely 80%. We put a 50% AMI cap on our program. And that created challenges in and of itself because a lot of people don't have any income documentation, let alone documentation that they were laid off due to COVID. So even though they self-certified for their COVID-related loss, the income documentation in general was difficult, and a lot of people had to do, handwritten letters from their former employers and things like that. And, we took as much as we possibly could, within reason.
Yeah, I think that that's so important. It's something we've been seeing nationally as well, where there's a struggle of a lot of applications ask for a lot of documentation, and that's a huge barrier, especially when everything is closed down and normal places, access points are no longer available, like public libraries. And yeah, so I think that we have time for one last question, and this is something that I've heard from audience members. A couple folks asked this when they were registering for the webinar. How can we keep all of this moving in terms of rental assistance? How can we sustain the support we need to get folks through this pandemic? And how can we strengthen the long-term fight for affordable housing for low-income renters?
So from our perspective at HIP, evaluation is absolutely key to making the case for these kinds of programs going forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning, due to capacity issues, that's not always something that the implementer themselves can do. We've sometimes seen cities and counties say, yeah, we were maybe gonna send out a little Google Form survey. And it's really important to know, to be able to make the case, I think also at the federal level, that this rental assistance had a real impact on people's lives at a time when housing and financial precarity, that long pre-existed the pandemic, has been exacerbated in ways that make previously vulnerable people even more vulnerable. And I think that being able to say that, my child was able to go to school and learn because I had rental assistance, I was able to be there, while they were learning remotely, all those things, being able to say quantitatively and qualitatively that that was the case, that will help us, keep these funds available and hopefully create a national safety net going forward.
We have a national rent assistance program. It's called Section 8. And if Congress wanted to, they could make it an entitlement and decide that housing is a right for all people in this country.
Absolutely. Dominique, did you want to add something? I think I saw you unmute yourself for a second.
Yeah, so I think it's just is a matter of continuing to work with the stakeholders and just make sure that funding is going to help to keep folks housed, and making sure that we're also just providing generally more affordable housing for people on an average base, on an average day. Making sure that people are able to start somewhere that is affordable, so that way when crises do happen, people are a little bit more stable in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to make sure that we end on time, since everybody's time here is really valuable and there are so many questions. We will follow up with folks' questions. I see a lot of stuff going on in the chat as well as in the Q&A. But I just wanted to make kind of this one last plug. I think that everybody has already, said it. This is a really big long-term fight, and there are choices that Congress makes. And so please do contact your representatives to make sure that Congress gets back to work, works on rent relief, and hopefully we'll all be on the better side of all this after the pandemic ends. So for any outstanding questions, if you have logged in and if you are an anonymous attendee, please do email me. I'm going to drop my email. Oh, actually, I forgot about this slide. Please email me, please contact anybody you have any like specific questions to follow up with. And again, thank you so much for spending an hour with us today. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your stories and expertise on this, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.